to just go for it, and the first step was to take all of my acetic acid and to add a bunch of solvent called dichloromethane, or DCM for short. Then on top of this, I added some magnesium sulfate drying agent, which would pull out a bunch of residual water, and after letting it stir for a while, I filtered it all directly into a large flask. By doing this, I was able to quickly get rid of all of the magnesium sulfate, and eventually I was left with a nice and clear solution, which should have already been a lot drier. With that being said though, I then set it up for yet another distillation, except this time I included this really long piece of glass, which is something called a fractionating column. This is because it would allow me to do a fractional distillation where I would get a much better separation of water and acetic acid, and I just went ahead and cranked up the heating. The idea here was to then first distill off all of the DCM, which would come over at around 40°C, but the important part was that it wouldn't distill off alone, and it was supposed to pull any remaining water along with it. This was also exactly what seemed to be happening, because all of the DCM that was coming over was looking cloudy, which told me that it was full of water. What was then a very good sign was that as I kept collecting it, the drops slowly cleared up, meaning that there was less and less water, and when all of the DCM was eventually gone, the temperature started rising. I then waited for it to get to exactly 118°C, which was the boiling point of acetic acid, and when it eventually got there, I waited about 30 seconds before quickly swapping the flasks. At this point, everything that I was collecting should have been absolutely pure and completely dry acetic acid, and something that I noticed was that, unlike all of the other distillations, there wasn't any fogging or smoke. But either way, I then continued collecting everything that came over, and the moment that the temperature started dropping below 118°C, I ended the distillation. I then took everything that I got, and I carefully poured it all into a nice bottle, and what I had now should have been 100% pure acetic acid. The only sad part was that the amount that I ended up with was only around 100 mils, which was less than half of what I started with before trying to dry it. However, this still should have been more than enough, and I was extremely happy that I was finally done this part, and that I had some theoretically pure acid. To actually know for sure that this was acetic acid though, I was gonna have to do some tests, and I decided to start with the easiest one, which was to just see if it smelled like super strong vinegar. Okay, that's definitely acetic acid. So, at least from this quick little acid-smelling experience, whoa, I was almost certain that this was pure acetic acid, but to fully prove it, I was of course gonna have to do some real tests. So, the first thing that I did on it was an FTIR, which I then followed up with an HNMR, and I was very happy to see that both of these together fully confirmed that this was for sure acetic acid, and that it was quite pure. What I was most happy about though was that I could finally move on to the next and final step, where I would get to turn all of this acetic acid into pure ethanol, and again, in theory, there were many ways to do this. The only tough part was that, at least initially, every method that I found seemed to have some sort of major downside. After hours of searching though, I ended up finding this paper, which described a process that appeared relatively easy, and it was supposed to have close to a 100% yield. In my mind, this was also by far the most promising method, and it seemed like it was my only real option, and I decided to give it a try. So I just went ahead and jumped right into it, and the first thing that I did was go over to my solvent cabinet, and I pulled out my DMSO. I then started pouring about 200 mils of this solvent into a large flask, and when it was all loaded in, I turned on the stirring. After that, I lowered in a little tube that was attached to my argon tank, and I started shooting in argon to push out all the air. I don't think this was absolutely necessary, but at the same time, this reaction was gonna produce a lot of hydrogen gas, and I was kind of paranoid that it could mix with the air in the flask and potentially explode. But with that being said, the flask was now full of argon, and what I had to do next was add the first main ingredient, which was a bunch of white powder. This was all something called sodium borohydride, which is a strong reducing agent, and very soon, this was the stuff that would be releasing the hydrogen. Right now, though, it was still relatively tame, and when it was eventually all added, I let it stir for about 10 minutes, just to give it some time to dissolve. Then, when I eventually felt that it was looking good, I went and got the second main ingredient, which was 9.6 grams of my beautiful acetic acid, and I started to slowly add it. This almost immediately caused there to be a bunch of bubbling, along with a pretty clear fizzing sound, and this was because the acetic acid was reacting with the sodium borohydride and releasing some of that hydrogen gas that I mentioned earlier. More importantly though, it was supposed to be forming an intermediate known as sodium triacetoxy borohydride, which right now might not look like anything useful, but it'll be very important in a bit. Also, I should mention that the 9.6 grams that I was using here was only around 10% of the acetic acid that I had, and this is because at this point, I still had absolutely no idea if this reaction actually worked, and I was too scared to risk more than this. But anyway, once I had added everything, I again had to let it stir for several minutes to make sure that it all fully reacted. While this was happening though, I had to prepare the next major ingredient, and to do this, I started by adding an addition funnel above the flask. With this in place, I then went and got another chemical called methane sulfonic acid, and I added 53.8 grams of this syrupy liquid into the funnel. On top of this, I also added another 200 mils of DMSO, which easily mixed with it, except in theory, I probably shouldn't have been adding a solvent to an acid. I mean, in this case, I knew it would be fine, but that can't always be assumed. And for example, if I had done this with sulfuric acid and water, it probably would have boiled and potentially sprayed out of the funnel. But either way, once it was all mixed, I sealed the top with a stopper, and now I was ready to make some ethanol. So I just went over to the valve on the addition funnel, and I very carefully opened it to drop-wise add the methane sulfonic acid, and almost immediately, I could see that it was reacting. This was because there were a bunch of very small bubbles that quickly appeared, which was all hydrogen gas, that was forming as the acid attacked the sodium borohydride. As far as I know though, this was mostly just a side reaction, and what I actually wanted the acid to do was catalyze a reaction between the sodium borohydride and the sodium triacetoxy borohydride that I made earlier. The paper itself, unfortunately, didn't give any details about this reaction, but what I think is likely is that the sodium borohydride was splitting apart the sodium triacetoxy borohydride and turning it into something called acetaldehyde. This was then probably getting attacked again by the sodium borohydride, which would be reducing it even further, and hopefully turning it into some amazing ethanol. Overall, I thought that this was all pretty exciting, except what did concern me was that the paper also didn't give any real details about the reaction process itself, and unfortunately, even though it was still very early on, it was looking like it was going to be a temperamental one. This is because after barely adding any acid, it was already warming up, and at this point, it was getting up to around 40 C. It was also looking like it was slowly getting foamier and foamier, which would only get worse as it heated up, and I was definitely going to have to cool it down. So I just quickly added a large dish under the flask, and I filled it with a bunch of water, and this very quickly brought the temperature down to around 15 degrees Celsius, which I was very happy to see. This is because the crisis seemed to be over, and even though it was still bubbling, it appeared to be much more controlled, And now, I figured that I just had to add the rest of the acid. So, that was exactly what I did, and what I thought was really interesting was that as I added it, the reaction seemed to go through a few different phases. For example, for some reason, despite the cooling, it all started getting frothier and frothier again, except right when I started getting concerned that it might eventually foam out of the flask, it all suddenly thinned out. This then made me think that I was basically in the clear and that I was past the worst of it, but then it suddenly started thickening way worse than before, and it actually ended up completely freezing. At the same time, it was also slowly puffing up, which was very concerning, except it again just suddenly started thinning out, and it wasn't long before it completely liquefied. This constant back and forth, though, made it so that I absolutely didn't trust it anymore, and I became constantly worried that at some point it could just start foaming uncontrollably, except that thankfully never happened. This is because it actually ended up being super tame, and when I eventually added the last bit of acid, I was left with a nice and slightly gray solution. At this point, though, the reaction wasn't quite done yet, and I was gonna have to let it stir like this for a bit longer. So while I was waiting, I went and got a beaker, and I added about 180 mils of water. Then after that, I dumped in 20 grams of sodium hydroxide drain cleaner, and I turned on the stirring, and I waited for it to fully dissolve. When this eventually happened, I had a nice and clear solution, and at this point, it had been about 15 minutes, so I went back to my reaction, which now should have been done, and I started pouring all of this into it. This strongly basic solution was then quenching the reaction, and it was destroying any sodium borohydride or acid that remained. For whatever reason, it also caused the whole thing to clear up quite a bit, and I started noticing little drops of something oily appearing on the side of the flask. But moving on, what I had to do next was get all of the ethanol that I hopefully made out of this mixture of chemicals. According to the paper, this was also relatively easy, and apparently, all I had to do was some more distillations. So I just immediately got started with that by getting rid of the water dish, and then I quickly added a stopper, a fractional column, and another stopper, and I put together pretty much the same setup that I just did for the acetic acid. I then cranked up the heating, and it wasn't long before the first stuff started coming over at around 35°C, which I assumed was that oily junk that I saw before. More specifically though, I was pretty sure that this was all something called dimethyl sulfide, which was supposed to be a major side product in this reaction. The only unfortunate part was that it was also supposed to smell absolutely horrible, but at such a low boiling point, I figured that it would be removed pretty easily. With that being said, I then just kept collecting it until the temperature suddenly started spiking, and when it eventually got to about 80°C, I swapped the flask for a fresh one. This was because at this point, if there were any ethanol in there, this was when it would start coming over. The only tricky part was that it wasn't going to be coming over as pure ethanol, and it would instead be a combination of ethanol and water. This in turn meant that to get all of the ethanol, I was also going to have to collect all of the water that was in there, which was around 200 mils, and over the next couple hours, the volume in the flask slowly rose. At the same time, the amount in the main flask slowly went down, and with less and less water, a bunch of solid stuff started forming, and this was all just junk from the reaction that was being left behind. Going back to the other flask though, it did eventually get to the point that it was around 200 milliliters, and right when this happened, I turned off the heating. I then quickly popped off the flask, and what I had now was, at least in theory, around 5% ethanol, which I thought was pretty exciting. However, just by looking at it and seeing all of the little oil drops that were still somehow floating around, it was obvious that I was going to have to clean it a bit more. So I decided to do another distillation, except this time I would use a much more efficient fractional column, which would hopefully give me a better separation of ethanol and water. I then just went ahead and cranked up the heating, and I basically did the same thing as before, where I rejected everything that came over below 80°C. The major difference this time, though, was that I wasn't going to be collecting all the water, and I was actually going to try to leave behind as much as possible by pulling off the flask the moment that the temperature got to 100°C. So that was exactly what I did, and then I very carefully transferred everything that I got to a little vial, and at this point, I was pretty happy with how things were going. This was because, assuming that the reaction had worked, what I had now should have been relatively clean ethanol. To fully confirm this though, I was going to have to run it through my NMR, so that was what I did, and well, it told me that it wasn't super pure, but it was for sure ethanol. To get its concentration, I then did another test by putting a few drops of the ethanol onto something known as a refractometer, and when I looked into it, it told me that it was at least 80%, which was actually better than I expected. The only unfortunate part was that when I went to do the very necessary smell test, I was not very impressed. This is because instead of getting a nice and clean ethanol smell, it was almost unbearably sulfury, with a horrible rotten cabbage stench. I also almost immediately knew that this was all coming from residual dimethyl sulfide, which was somehow able to make it through the distillations, and I was honestly getting a bit worried that this might end up being a problem. At the same time, though, I felt that it was probably fine, and that it could be easily removed with some more distilling, and instead, I decided to focus on how well this reaction had worked. I mean, the yield wasn't even close to the 93% in the paper, and it was more like 48% because they didn't fully isolate it like I did, but overall, I still really liked the process, and I liked that it was relatively simple and easy. So I decided to just keep going with it, and to use it to convert the rest of the acetic acid that still remained, which was about 89 milliliters. The only problem with this plan, though, was that if I were to just repeat exactly what I did, I would have had to do it 10 more times, which sounded absolutely horrible. This is especially because it would have taken at least 10 more days of work, and to avoid this, I ended up just scaling everything up by buying a brand new 5-liter flask. I then did the exact same reaction as before, except with way more of everything, and the only real difference this time was that cooling it was a bit more difficult. When the reaction was eventually done, it also looked really interesting, and it was kind of mesmerizing to look at, and it was a bit sad when I had to quench it by dumping in the solution of sodium hydroxide. But either way, after this, I then did the distillation to get out all of the water, except this time, instead of immediately doing a second distillation, I poured it all into a different flask. This was because, even on this ridiculously large scale, I was only able to process half of the acetic acid, and before moving on, I was gonna have to convert the other half that still remained. So, that was exactly what I did, and when I was eventually done the reaction and distillation, I took everything that I got, and I combined it with the stuff from the first half. This way, I would be able to distill both of them at the same time, which was just a bit more efficient than doing them separately, and when I was done a couple hours later, I had what looked like a pretty decent amount of 80% ethanol. I then took everything that I got, and I carefully poured it all into a fresh bottle, and in total, it ended up being just over 80 milliliters. I then brought back the roughly 6 mils that I got from the first run, which, together with this, was now nearly 90 mils, and this was way more than I ever expected to get, and I was feeling pretty happy about it. The only problem was that right now, it was all still nowhere near drinkable, because it all smelled terrible, and it likely tasted like horribly rotten cabbage. As I mentioned earlier, though, I felt that this would be relatively easy to get rid of, and that I would just have to combine everything and do one final distillation. However, just like everything else in this project, that absolutely wasn't the case, and even though I included a bunch of copper, which was supposed to help remove sulfur compounds, the final result that I got was still far from good. That smells pretty bad. I mean, it was definitely better, but it was still nowhere near drinkable, and to get rid of this stubborn crap, it was looking like I was just gonna have to keep distilling it over and over. So, that was exactly what I did, and what I did as well was filter it each time through a mixture of activated charcoal and ion exchange resin, which was basically just a deconstructed Brita water filter, and I think it helped. Overall, though, not only did this whole process turn out to be really time-consuming and tedious, it was also not very efficient. This was because, to make any significant improvement, I found that I had to sacrifice quite a bit of the initial stuff that came over at ADC. This in turn meant that I lost more and more with every distillation, where by the fourth one, I barely had any left. However, on the bright side, everything that I was collecting now was coming over in the very narrow range of 80 to 81C, which told me that it was quite pure. There was also a very good chance that I'd finally gotten rid of that horrible smell, and that all of this stuff here was actually drinkable, which I thought was pretty exciting. It was then only 5 minutes later, when I was getting really close to being done, except what I had collected at this point was honestly a really sad amount of liquid. I mean, compared to what I'd started with, this was basically nothing, and in hindsight, I really should have avoided any method involving sulfur. On the bright side, though, at least from what I could tell, it was looking like I'd somewhat managed to salvage things, and at this point, it was done, so I swapped out the vial. Now, all that there was left to do was to see how it smelled, and I was honestly kind of nervous and worried that it would be terrible, and that I would have to keep distilling it until I basically had nothing. That's perfect. Except that thankfully wasn't the case. I mean, there was still a very slight hint of something else, but other than that, it basically smelled like pure ethanol, and when I ran the NMR, it was clearly way better. More specifically, that massive impurity that was here was now just an extremely small bump, and when I compared it to an NMR of some ethanol that I bought at the store, it basically looked the same. I then tested the concentration using the refractometer, which told me that it was about 68%, and it was surprising to see that it was somehow lower than before. With all that being said, though, I was now finally done, and after what was probably way too much effort, it was looking like I had successfully turned a gallon of children's glue into some drinkable alcohol. I finally did it. What a sad amount. At this point, there was also, of course, only one thing left to do, which was to taste it, and to see if all of this effort was worth it. So, that was what I had to do next, except as a quick warning, I should be clear that tasting anything that I make is always at my own risk, and even if it seems fine based on the NMR and other tests, there could always be something toxic or horrible still in there. But with that warning aside, it was finally time to see how it was, and I was honestly feeling a bit nervous. I guess I just have to go ahead and try it. And I hope I'm not poisoning myself. Yeah, okay, I'll just taste it. That's not good. I mean, there's the obvious fact that it's almost 70% ethanol, so it just burns, but it definitely has a characteristic flavor. And when I think a bit more about it, it may be definitely some sort of like some sort of volatile hydrocarbon, like gasoline or something. Definitely has it has a chemical flavor to it. I don't know how else to describe it. Overall, though, is it horrible? No. I think it's totally drinkable if you have nothing else. I mean, assuming it doesn't have some poison in it that kills you, but besides that risk, it's kind of fine. So, in the end, it unfortunately wasn't the amazing alcohol that I was hoping for, but at the same time, I think that it was probably as good as it could have been. I also think that the weird chemical gasoline flavor makes it really unique, and maybe I'm just lying to myself, but I kind of feel like it's growing on me. Overall, though, I'm really happy with how my glue alcohol turned out, and what I think is nice is that I'm now officially building a little alcohol collection, and I can place this next to my toilet paper moonshine that I made years ago. I've also already set it up for there to be a third spot here, which is reserved for what is probably going to be my final project in this series, where I try to turn air into alcohol. This is actually a project that I mentioned over a year ago, and I just wanted to take a second to say that this whole time I have been working on it, and I'm hoping to finish it very soon. I should also say that the same goes to all of the other huge projects that I've mentioned over the years, like making magnets from scratch, graphene aerogel, carbon nanotubes, liquid helium, and tungsten cubes. In fact, although I haven't been posting much, I've actually been working on over 20 projects at the same time and spending pretty much all of my waking hours on them, and at this point, my brain's getting close to being overloaded with information. Despite my brain being fried, though, I've still been able to keep up with the latest news in science and with what's happening around the world in general, thanks to Ground News, the sponsor of this video. If you haven't already heard of Ground News, it's an independent app and website created by a former NASA engineer that is dedicated to helping you think critically about the information you consume. More specifically, though, Ground News does this by aggregating news articles and offering helpful tools and contexts which allow you to see the potential bias in a story and to compare it across many media outlets. For example, I recently found a story on Ground News about NASA's mission to asteroid Bennu, where they discovered that it had most of the essential building blocks of life, suggesting that life on Earth might have arisen from an asteroid impact. This type of discovery can be quite controversial, though, and any story on it has a lot of room for potential bias, except with Ground News, I found that this wasn't really a problem. This was because I was able to see the story from more of a bird's eye view, where I could scan over the many different headlines from various outlets, and I could quickly see where they leaned politically and how factually accurate they were. This then allowed me to choose the articles that I felt would give me a more balanced perspective and to avoid the ones that chose to frame it more sensationally with headlines like, "Are we all aliens?" What I also really like is that on top of this, they offer a visual breakdown where I'm able to see how a story is covered across the political spectrum, and what I think is interesting is that it shows that this one was mostly covered by center-leaning outlets. This means that for many outlets, this story was a complete blind spot, and this is why I really like their feature called the blind spot feed, which highlights stories that I might be missing, and I found that it really helps me avoid getting stuck in any information bubbles. With all that being said, though, I definitely feel that Ground News has given me a much more balanced perspective, and I really recommend checking them out. For a limited time, you can also get 40% off their Unlimited Vantage plan, which works out to be about $5 per month, by going to ground.news/NileRed or by scanning my QR code. But yeah, that's about it. So,